I'm Jasmine El-Gamal, and this is The View from Here. It's been 3.5 years since Russia invaded Ukraine, and despite intense negotiations by multiple parties, including the EU and the US, the two sides still seem farther apart than ever. So I sat down for this week's episode with my friend and Russia analyst Alexander Gabuev to try to understand Vladimir Putin's worldview. What are the events that shaped his thinking? What does he really want out of Ukraine? And how the war has affected Russians, both inside of Russia and outside. Alexander Gabuev, welcome to The View from Here.
Thanks, Jasmine. It's great to be with you.
Let me just talk about your background a little bit first so that people know exactly what your experience has been on these issues. You've lived in Russia, you've worked in Russia, you were at the Carnegie Moscow Center before you were forced to leave the country due to what had become a really threatening environment for anyone not supporting President Putin. This was at the beginning of the war, the most recent war with Ukraine. You're now in Berlin running the Carnegie Russia-Eurasia Center, where you're also steeped in the European decision-making process vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine. And also, really interestingly, Sasha, you have also written and looked a lot at the role of China as a backer of Russia in this war. And in fact, one of the things that you've written recently that I thought was so interesting is that you said that the deepening of the Russian-Chinese alignment is one of the most consequential geopolitical outcomes of Russia's war against Ukraine. But just to start out, let's step back for a second. I want us to ask you to take us to the extent that you can inside Vladimir Putin's head and talk to us about what his worldview is and what he actually wants.
I don't have a crystal ball, Jasmine. And,
is that too much to ask?
That's too much to ask, but I can try to the best of my ability. We know that Vladimir Putin is trained as a KGB agent, right? As anybody in the services, particularly somebody who is a field operative, needs to maintain a certain degree of secrecy and sometimes lying. So deception, not being very transparent and so on is a feature, not a bug, on the way that Vladimir Putin operates. So that obscures a lot of information from the outside observers. That's number one. And point number two, he's been in charge for 25 years at the helm of the giant pyramid, a giant bureaucratic machine. People who are in charge of these countries for so long without any democratic institutions to check and actually to support you, because responsibility is shared. You are ultimately responsible for everything. That probably makes you very lonely. And as we know, Vladimir Putin has not been surrounded by a group of people who have been with him all this time and are his confidants, where he can, share this responsibility of running the state as a collective body. It's not even Politburo. He is the Tsar. So he doesn't share his mind with too many people, right? And if these people know something, they don't necessarily share it with the outside world. And then three, after COVID, he has seen way fewer people than before COVID. He's been in a long self-isolation with de facto his bodyguards and a couple of people he knows. You need to sit in quarantine for 3 weeks to get to see him, even for half an hour, sit across these very long tables. So the information that he gets about the outside world is in a way distorted, right? He relies on paper printouts from the various 1 or 2 pagers from the services that people bring to him. He talks on the phone for people inside his system. He doesn't talk too much to people from outside of Russia, particularly from people in the West. Nobody's calling him. Talking to him is seen as not as a tool of diplomacy or negotiation, but more as a reward. So this is really rare. But it also affects his worldview and our ability to know about his worldview right now, right? It's just like layers of enigmas. wrapped in riddle or whatever it is, right? But we actually do know a couple of things. We know that Vladimir Putin was awarded a lieutenant colonel rank when he was retiring. Not the highest rank you can retire from services. He's not a 4-star KGB genius. He was somebody working more on the counterintel side, and his only assignment outside of the Soviet Union has been in Eastern Germany. And not in Berlin, but in second-tier city Dresden, where he was liaising with Stasi, the German Secret Service. So KGB didn't assess him to be the Soviet super spy who would be entrusted to be posted in Washington, D.C. or London or any of this prestigious posting during the Cold War on the enemy territory. But he was posted in the Soviet province, right? Eastern Germany at the time, and not in the capital city, but in the second tier city. So the assessment of the KGB was that he's not the brightest person, right? That's one. And he was returned to Leningrad and put at a university to basically spy on teachers and students and so on. Not a brilliant career in the KGB, right? And then throughout the 90s, when he was in his 30s, right, and 40s, like the formative experience, he already had a family, the Soviet Union collapsed. Like the whole world that he knew, the country that he was born in, collapsed in front of his eyes. And he saw a preview in Eastern Germany already on how this country's collapsed. And then everybody from the security services are thrown out. There is illustrations and all the various processes of dealing with the past. So I think for him, that was not only a collapse of like these tectonic big shifts of blades of history, but also his personal life has collapsed and he had to reinvent himself. So he became deputy mayor in St. Petersburg, former Leningrad, at the time where organized crime was notorious. He was in charge of foreign relations of the city, and that meant being in charge of St. Petersburg port. So all of the flows of drugs, weapons, all of the dirty stuff in and out of the city was done with his support or permission, or he definitely was aware of stuff and was paid off, as was established by multiple Russian independent investigations done by brilliant reporters, some of whom are not with us anymore. Well, this transformative years, 10 years, being on the payroll of Russian organized crime. And then he becomes Russian president and gradually eradicates the opposition, the free press, free elections, and becomes the Tsar. He still runs the elections, but he's fully in charge. Being in charge of that country requires talent. So I wouldn't say that he's just a lucky, mediocre person who is just there and who happens to be there. Right? You need to be really smart and cunning in order to be able to run this thing and achieve what he has achieved. But he's deeply distrusting of everybody around him, very suspicious, very conspiratorial, and also not entirely very bright. Like he doesn't fully understand how the outside world operates. And finally, the glorious past is much more an inspiration for him than thinking about the future. So he knows what AI is. He understands some of these concepts and technologies and so on. But it doesn't really galvanize him and say, oh, I want to build this country that's really forward-looking. For him, the aspiration is really the periods of Soviet and then Imperial Russian history, where Russia was strong, where Russia was expanding, where Russia was dominating its neighborhood. And this very kind of 19th century, 20th century look at the world power, where we need to have more territory, we need to have a protection belt, we need to have more people, and we conquer people in order to be inside the country. I think that's his definition of success. And that's also a big limiting factor for crafting Russia's smart strategy into the 21st century. And that's partly the big source of horrible war in Ukraine, because ultimately, if you say like, okay, there are many factors that led us into this war, name me one single factor that was the most important. I would say it's Vladimir Putin. If there would be a different Russian leader in charge, he could respond to various challenges of cohabiting with Ukraine as an independent state, of NATO expansion, whatever that was, differently. And probably invasion of Ukraine was the worst of all the answers, but that was Vladimir Putin's answer.
It's such a fascinating psychological perspective taking of him, because you're describing this person who really in his formative years saw the Soviet Union as this really big, powerful, positive thing. And since its collapse, it's almost like everything that he's done or tried to do is try to recapture that feeling and that glory and that sense of power, because that's all he knows. And it's sort of stopping him from thinking about what a different future might look like. But he's managed to survive this far, and he's managed to evade any kind of effort to contain him, to contain his ambitions, to prevent the invasion of Ukraine. So you were talking about how he's not that bright, but he really is kind of wily and he is kind of smart in some ways. How did it get to the point where, knowing what we know about him, he still was able to invade Ukraine and get to a point where 3 years into this war, as you've written yourself, the two sides seem farther away than ever and peace seems more elusive than ever?
Well, I think that part of his success, if we can describe it like that, staying in power or staying in the fight despite the collective West pushback and so on, is not only his personal characteristics, but also he presides over a pretty powerful country that I would be not advising anybody to discount. And like you probably heard it yourself that, but Russia's size is GDP of Spain. Name me one single Russian technology. They have nothing, just, beautiful women that they export, gas, and maybe like old rotten weapons. Ha 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 ha. Right? I think that this is an oversimplification of the country. It's much more complex. A lot of traits inside Russia make it deeply unattractive to not only outsiders, but people like myself, like Russians who feel ashamed that country is so unmodernized and there is so much room for improvement, both in material, in spiritual terms, in the ways that the country functions overall. But for the purpose of injecting yourself in the Middle East and propping up regime like Bashar Assad's, or going full into this war in Ukraine and staying there, Russia, I think, is the beast that's pretty well suited, unfortunately. So there is this match between Vladimir Putin and the country he runs. And also, among the kind of good and positive qualities of Putin, he is the autocrat who understands his own limitations on certain things. And for example, like there are autocrats who try to run their economy. Like in Turkey, Recep Erdogan, for a moment decided that he's a brilliant economist and he can run the economy, and then he ran his country into hyperinflation that the current team is trying to fix. Vladimir Putin never made this mistake. He understands that the economy is better managed by professionals. And if you look at the Russian bureaucracy, his generals are horrible. But he's governor of the central bank, he's minister of finance, everybody who runs the economic machinery is really brilliant. They are world-class professionals. That's very unfortunate because that gives a lot of runway, steam to the Russian war machine. But that's also the way he governs. So he wants to be in charge of all of the bureaucracies that have real military power or security power. So the police, the domestic security system, the FSB, the military. And that's where you put your friends, your loyalists, and nobody who is too brilliant, too ambitious. You want to put a mediocre person that you have some dirty stuff on them, and then you divide and rule. That's how you run the system. But on the economy, which is not threatening, like the governor of the central bank will not arrest you. You put the most brilliant person in your system, and that's a woman named Elvira Nabiullina. So that's part of the feature. But then going back to why he invaded Ukraine, and that's what you asked me about. I think part of what we discuss about Putin is that, this past glory, but also his grievances about the West, because he came to power as perhaps the most pro-Western leader that Russia had in many years, apart from maybe Mikhail Gorbachev. But he was somebody who really wanted Russia to be integrated into the West. Well, he famously asked Clinton, what about Russia becoming a member of NATO? And I think that his vision for Russia was to be Italy. And the role model for him, if you remember this politician, was Silvio Berlusconi, the very rich Italian prime minister, surrounded by young women, all of this posh luxury lifestyle.
Yeah.
Somebody very manipulative, but being able to be accepted inside the family nevertheless. So I think that Putin's desire was to be consulted with and being able to sit at the table with given all of the formal, signs of respect, acceptance, and so on. And I think that what he discovered was that Russia was never really intended to be taken in the transatlantic family in its institutional framework. NATO membership, EU membership was off the table. Russia was invited into G7 that expanded to G8, but finance ministers were never invited because who is Russia to be sitting together with the G7 finance ministers? And all of these signs told him over time that, okay, I will not be accepted as an equal. And then his consolidation of control inside Russia and stifling of Russian democracy made him an autocrat that was really a very odd combination in G8 among democratically elected leaders because he never had a really free democratic election. So if you remember when he annexed Crimea in 2014, Russia was kicked out of G8. And part of his emotions that he shared with people, and it was still kind of possible to report that. I was working as a reporter for the best business newspaper, Kommersant, back then. So we had a lot of access to various people. And his emotion was like, who are you, Barack Obama, to kick me out of G7? I was there before you were there. You were a junior senator when I was running Russia already. Who are these people? There is nobody who is my equal. So this grudges, resentment, and his comparison of himself with, Peter the Great, while all of these European and Western leaders are dwarfs, is very much ingrained. So it's also personal. But then for some reason, Vladimir Putin believes that Ukraine needs to be in the Russian sphere of influence, and Russia needs to be dominant in Ukraine. So he believes that without controlling Ukraine, Russia is not great power anymore.
Controlling it or annexing it? Would having a pro-Russian president, for example, be good enough for him? Or does he actually just want to take over the entire territory? Because I have heard people say that what he really wants out of this war is to get rid of Zelensky altogether, bring someone on board who is pro-Russian as a way to control it.
Yeah, I think that's the annexation of Ukraine was not part of the plan. If people are trying to convince us that the moment Putin came to power and he put his hand on the Russian constitution during his first inauguration in May 2000, he was repeating February 24th, 22. That's the day when I go in and invade Ukraine and make it part of Russia. I think that's really false. And he had a chance of, taking over Ukraine. And that was winter 2015, after Ukraine was crushed in the Battle of Donbass with the Russian separatists backed by Russians and Russians fighting alongside the separatists, leading them and being de facto a force fighting Ukrainian army with no insignia or without any acceptance of the Russian role. So the best opportunity to do it militarily was there. And that's where he settled for the now famous Minsk Accords, which in his view would give him control over Ukraine politically, because they forced Ukraine to make these autonomies in Donetsk and Luhansk, the two regions of Ukraine, to have a de facto veto power over major foreign policy decisions of Ukraine. So if you control these two, if you have your puppet governments there, you have a veto power over Ukrainian foreign policy. And then a lot of stuff about the rights of the Russian speakers in Ukraine, the Russian Orthodox Church, and so on. A lot of these demands that the current war and the current Russian negotiation position inherits, because these are the tools where he wants to have in order to control Ukraine. So I don't think that territorial annexation is his only plan. He wants to have a Russia-friendly government in Ukraine, and that's quintessential. Taking a step back, I think two things are very important. Number one, why is domination over Ukraine the metrics for assessing Russia as a great power? Without dominating Ukraine, Russia has the largest or second largest nuclear arsenal on par of the United States. It sits in the UN Security Council as a permanent member, having veto over all the major decisions. It had very beneficial, friendly relationship with Europe. NATO was expanding politically, but was at the same time demilitarizing. Nobody thought that war will be possible again in Europe, like not war with Russia necessarily. So yeah, let's expand this big club, of democracies and so on, feel good about that. But that was not a very popular or vivid organization before Russia invaded Crimea. And with that, you had all the cards to, bring your living standards to Canada level or Norwegian level, right? Be friendly and waiting for this 21st century geopolitical contest between China and the US, where you will be friendly with both. And both sides would be courting you and asking you to be at least, neutral or friendly and maybe in their camp. And you can collect all the benefits and so on. So why domination over Ukraine? So this is really rooted in history, in his views about, Kyiv is the cradle of the Russian civilization and so on. And his lack of understanding that Ukraine is a separate country for more than 2 decades. That, yes, its identity is a work in progress. There are a lot of Russian speakers, a lot of citizens of Ukraine who don't speak Ukrainian language. It's, in a way, an artificial modern country, just the way so many countries around the world are, right? And then with that, the new identity, the new understanding of their history is already there and injected in the new generation. And then the elite of this country wants to have a country of their own, not a Russia province. That's very clear. So it's very difficult to undo Ukrainian national projects because it has taken deep roots. And there is also a lot of people who are deeply Ukrainian in their consciousness. These oligarchs in the elite who don't want to be part of Russia. And then the role model for a country like Ukraine, it looks at Russia and says, yeah, like Russia might be wealthy and powerful, but we will never have nukes. We will never have their oil and gas deposits. We will never have a seat at the UN Security Council. So what's the role model? And then you look at Poland, just next door. Member of NATO, member at the EU, with GDP per capita so much higher than yours, and say, okay, that would be the model if we join the EU and if we join NATO. So Russia was unattractive for both the elite and the educated class. So chasing this idea of domination over Ukraine was fool's errand from the beginning for Putin. And unfortunately, every step that he's taken over Ukraine saying, you are mine, you belong to me, you need to be with us, we're brothers, is only it gets farther away, particularly as more and more blood was spilled. Like Crimea annexation was without blood spilled, but nevertheless, that was pretty traumatizing. People have been expelled, like it's a blatant violation of international law. Then he's meddling into Donbass and participation in what started as a civil unrest fueled by Russia and then became a proxy war between Ukraine and Russian-backed separatists with Russian fighting for them. Already a lot of blood has been spilled, and that has multiplied with his horrible invasion into Ukraine that gets bigger and bigger and bigger.
Putin just doesn't believe in Ukrainian national identity. He doesn't believe in it as a separate country. He sees it slipping farther and farther away. Yes, there are these separatists, pro-Russian separatists in certain areas, but by and large, this is a country that wants to move forward, move towards the EU, be included in all of these institutions. But what actually is the impetus for the full-scale invasion that has now been going on for 3 years? Now, I was looking back and I was thinking there are two things that I wanted to put out and get your reaction. This invasion of Ukraine didn't happen overnight. I mean, there was so much that led up to it. In 2015, at the Munich Security Conference, you and I were both there. So I was there with my boss at the Department of Defense. There was this big debate inside the U.S. government about whether or not the West, the U.S. specifically, Germany, should provide lethal assistance to Ukraine. And it was a big debate. And then Vice President at the time, Biden, goes to the Munich Security Conference. Supposedly there's going to be discussions about this, but then Angela Merkel steps up to the podium and kind of gets ahead of these discussions a little bit and just announces, we're not providing Ukraine with lethal weapons. And I remember that being a really significant, tense moment where it felt like she kind of pulled the rug out from under Vice President Biden and the discussions that were ongoing at the time. She flat out says, at the same time that she's trying to negotiate with Putin, she's saying we're not providing lethal assistance to Ukraine. Around the same time, Russia is supporting the Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria. A lot of the tactics that we've seen in Ukraine over the last 3 years, the bombing of the hospitals, maternity wards, ambulances, all of that we saw the Russians do in Syria. To no real cost imposed on them. Not really. And again, I was in government at the time. I was leading the Syria team, and I remember seeing Russia encroaching more and more into Syria. And I remember having these discussions with my colleagues where it's like, what are we doing to push back on Russia in Syria? Because this seems to be setting a really bad precedent. So I wonder what you think about those two moments that I've described and whether they had any impact on Putin's thinking long term and whether they slowly but surely emboldened him first in 2015 and then in 2022 to say, you know what, I can probably do this and get away with it.
I think that's part of it, and I think that you are right. The question is, what was realistically to be done back then, given how much security structures did Ukraine have to receive all of these weapons and stuff, right? And how much that would pull regular Russian troops, gloves off, no disguise, like you are willing to fight us, you're going to fight us. And then the perennial question whether Ukraine, that's outside of NATO, is worth facing Russia, which is a peer nuclear power. And the question, I think, all the time throughout the administrations have been answered by a no. I think that was the discussion around Ukraine all the time. And the call that, hey, this country is not inside the alliance. And are we really ready to face the Russians there, where we know for Putin that's existential? That's the reason why he invaded. For us, it's really not. And like, what's the risk, benefits analysis, and so on? I think that all the time after this painful interagency deliberations, the answer was not really. Was it too timid? Maybe. But I don't think that we have the benefit of the hindsight, like to say that a more muscular U.S. response would be met, with Russia saying, "Oh, sorry, we should never do that." Right?
Of course. That's why I say hindsight is always 2020. You don't know what would have happened had the U.S. done something different or had Angela Merkel made a different decision. I mean, I'm not arguing that sending in lethal weapons at the time was the right thing to do. I'm just wondering whether it emboldened Putin to sort of think that, hey, they don't really, you have Ukraine's back. No one's going to notice. I'll just go in. It'll be over before anyone knows it. And then it'll just be facts on the ground. So where do we go from here? Now, we've just had these two major events this month, the US-Russia summit in Alaska, and then the meeting between Ukraine and the US in Washington, where Zelensky was joined by top EU and NATO leaders. And that was a bit of a roller coaster, watching those two summits back to back, because we went from extreme alarm after the Putin-Trump meeting, where the red carpet was rolled out for Putin, and there was all these fears that Trump was going to abandon Ukraine entirely and just go with whatever Putin wanted. Followed by what seemed to be a positive meeting between Zelensky and the European leaders and Trump. And I read your excellent piece in Foreign Affairs on the 26th of August, where you were talking about this massive gulf between the two positions, the Ukrainian and the Russian one, and the fact neither the Europeans nor the Americans have really been able to offer a way to bridge that gap. Precisely because it seems so wide, and it seems very zero-sum if you look at it that way. What Putin wants is unacceptable to Zelensky and vice versa. So I want you to talk a little bit about where you see things going from here, where you see any potential openings. And you've also spoken about how China has become really invested in this, and it seems to be very much at odds with the European position vis-a-vis Ukraine and Russia. And you've also, in your writings, criticized the European negotiating strategy for being too maximalist. So help us try to understand where everything stands now and where this could be going.
I think that the gap between the Russian and Ukrainian positions will be there. I don't think that there is any credible way to bridge this gap. And the battlefield will be decisive for the negotiation. That's just the sad fact of life. Both sides are pretty determined because for Ukrainians, this issue is existential. For getting the security guarantees and making sure that the Russian invasion doesn't repeat. The 1991 borders, reparations from Russia, trial of all the war criminals remain aspirational, right? That's what Ukrainians want to have, and that's totally in line with international law and morally understandable and totally justifiable. The problem is that Ukrainians are unlikely to get that anytime soon. However, what they have and what they want to maintain is a viable state. The state that currently controls the territories that under Kyiv's rule, where Ukrainian is spoken, Ukrainian culture and identity can thrive, is there. It just needs the war to stop and not happen again. For the economic reconstruction to happen, for people to return to Ukraine, and for just a more stable long-term growth trajectory that will enable Ukraine to continue to exist as a state and then as a successful state, hopefully anchored into transatlantic structure, right? So the territory is not the most important part for now, but just viability of the state and security guarantees are crucial and thus non-negotiable for Ukrainians. On the Russian side, you have Putin, who is in charge, absolutely unopposed, who still has this maximalist objective to control Ukraine, and then having the option to reinvade still on the table as a big gun, that you all the time see this gun and you say, oh, it's better to be friendly with the Russians, otherwise they will invade, and I know that I don't have any protection. So better behave the way that Putin wants me to. That's Putin's plan. As long as both sides have the capacity to continue the war, I think they will, right? Because there is political will in the Kremlin and this existential nature in Ukraine. Then we might have three scenarios on how this can end. One is maximalist Ukrainian victory. Russia is defeated. Not only it cannot continue the war, but it's defeated, so it cannot impose the conditions, and then Ukraine can impose conditions. That was Zelensky's peace and victory plan. That was the maximalist vision that, well, on paper at least, Europe still supports.
So that's not going to happen, basically.
That's not going to happen. And then I think that, unfortunately, when you talk to the decision makers in privacy of their offices, like many of them whom you know say, oh, but of course this will never materialize. It's not for us to tell Ukrainians what they should aspire to. And if they aspire to all of this internationally, international law justified things that are morally justified, their country has suffered so much and so on, we cannot prevent them from asking for those. But then when you don't say that, okay, this is not going to happen in public, you're creating expectations in the public that then gets frustrated because it's never materialized. So we wanted to battle Moscow to surrender, they don't surrender, then what's our plan B, right? Or you are not really fully transparent with your public, which I think you should. And you don't need to disclose all the cards, but I think that's the part where when we see evaporating support for Ukraine among the publics, and that's partly driving Trump's desire to make it a commercial enterprise for the U.S., not funding the war anymore, but just making money on it and trying to bring both parties to peace through Steve Witkoff and so on. I think that's partly the sources of that, because the public is just not buying that we're going to have this outcome. So I think that the positive outcome for Ukraine is that you can bring Russia to a point where it can just not continue its war, that the cost of continuation of the war become too prohibitive, that Russia runs out of the manpower advantage and of equipment advantage that it enjoys over Ukraine. And then at some point, the Russians will say, okay, we need to settle for something. And then this something will be territory that they control, but they cannot undo stuff on the other side of the line of control, which is really deep integration between Ukraine and NATO. Not a membership, but NATO is all in this conflict through training, through weapons provisions, through intelligence sharing, helping Ukraine to design a lot of operations and so on. You just read the press to understand the depth of involvement of Western countries in helping Ukrainian self-defense. That's exactly what Russia wants to undo, but if Russia cannot continue the war, that it cannot undo this. And then de facto outcome will be Russia will control the territory that they stole. And there's probably no easy way for Ukraine to reclaim this territory. I think that still this outcome where Ukraine can, with a lot of Western support, bring Russia to a point where it can just not continue its offensive, it's possible. So I think that's a good aspirational outcome where Russians will have to settle for not being able to have a veto power over Ukrainian choices, right? To be there, Ukraine needs to address its manpower problem. It's a country much smaller than Russia. And then this gap in manpower can be compensated by the fact that Russia is in advance, so you need more men for a side that's advancing and trying to attack. You can compensate that through technology, through fortifications, through the smart employment of your manpower. And then the third outcome is a negative outcome, where Russia's advantage in material, in equipment, in personnel, starts to translate into bigger battlefield gains. And then Ukraine is losing territory at accelerated speed and then risks losing more and more and more. And then you need to stop that. And then part of the conditions is not only the de facto acknowledgement that Russia will control this territory, but also something else that Russia can impose on you. And the Russian ask will be to cut this link between Ukraine and NATO in terms of defense cooperation and so on and so forth. So it's more peace on Russian conditions, right? Which is a horrible outcome. So unfortunately, right now, I see us still in this dark tunnel where the dynamics on the battlefield are crucial. It doesn't mean to say that negotiations shouldn't start. During the Korean War, like there was 3 years of fighting, with 2 years of negotiation going in parallel. And like the largest losses on both sides, including the US, were during these 2 years. But then at some point, the situation on the battlefield allows you to settle on something, right? So that's probably a worthy trajectory, like a meaningful negotiation with the Russians, while at the same time beefing up Ukraine and helping it to endure in order to bring you to the battlefield dynamics that's favorable to Ukraine. I think that's been the Biden plan in the last iteration. They had some really ambitious, big ideas for what to do about Ukraine, NATO membership, and so on that I'm not so sold on. But nevertheless, there was a strategy. Unfortunately, I don't feel that President Trump has a strategy or the end game where he wants us to bring other than peace, that people stop dying. But there is a difference between peace where Russia is exhausted and cannot dictate to Ukraine under Kyiv's control on what to do about its security or language policy and so on, or peace on Putin's term. People stop dying, but then they are deprived of ability to choose their freedom, and then most likely Ukraine will need to reopen its borders. A lot of people will leave Ukraine. It will be a depopulated, uninvestable country. So it's a pretty miserable outcome. And that's my fear.
And it's a valid fear. Hearing you talk, I can't help thinking that this is an issue of, partly at least, an issue of competing timelines and whose timeline runs out first. Are the American people going to get tired of their taxpayer money going to fund wars that they're not involved in? And therefore U.S. support to Ukraine will trickle and slow and eventually end? Are the European publics going to at some point insist that their leaders put their funding, focus their funding domestically versus to help Ukraine? Or is the Russian economy going to grind to a halt and the war machine stops? In your article, you said the Russian economy has enough steam to support Putin's war machine for another 18 to 24 months. So we could be looking at another 2 years of this before anyone gets really, really tired enough to negotiate something. I wanted to quickly just ask you about the China factor. Do you think if push came to shove and Russia's economy was grinding to a halt and it looked like it was sputtering, would China inject any sort of life back into Russia to help keep it going to end this war on their terms?
I think that China already does. It's 30% of Russian export revenues, 40% of Russian imports, including imports critical for the Russian military machine, sophisticated chips, machine tools, everything what goes into weapons production, is very much dependent on Chinese supplies. China gets cheap natural resources from Russia. It gets a lot of weapons designs, including battle-tested weapon design, because Ukrainian war is a big laboratory for Western weapons manufacturers and also for the Russians, and they most likely share some of their know-hows and experience with the Chinese. And for them, cementing Russia's role as a junior partner, isolated from the West, on their terms, is actually a net positive outcome. So I think that going forward, The Russian economy will not necessarily hit this wall where they cannot support it anymore. It's more on the manpower side where they have this vulnerability. And long term, they're creating a big headache for themselves going forward. Russia is eating up a lot of its future potential through this horrible, immoral war. But that's not a problem for China. That's the problem for the Russians to sort out. China is benefiting here. And I think that the problem is, like, can you make China interested in peace resolution that's favorable to Ukraine? And I think that Chinese are not necessarily opposed to Ukraine existing as an independent state and all of that. It's just they say, okay, what's in it for me, the West? Like, if you want tit for tat, do you want just tap me on your shoulder and say, like, oh, good boy, China, you contributed to the rules-based international order, and now we will continue to support Taiwan and to criticize you over Uyghurs and Tibet and Xi Jinping's overstaying in power and all of that, right? And export controls and chip wars and all of this. Right? Or we find a modus vivendi with you, taking some of your interests into account, which Chinese know will not happen, right? And I think that's that where they see everything very transactional. They don't see any end game where the West will say, okay, China, we are ready to compete with you if we agree on terms and so on, and it's a fair competition.
But it's interesting the way that you talk about it as if, it's almost like a whole other negotiation track where what could you talk about with the Chinese to get them to support an option to end this war that's even slightly favorable to the Ukrainians. And that seems like a very important discussion to be happening with the Chinese. I don't know to what extent those discussions are happening.
Jake Sullivan used to had one. I was definitely not in the room, but from what I know, I think that the discussion was also taking the Chinese interests into consideration, because defeat of Putin's Russia, a different government in the Kremlin that would be pro-Western and would be willing, to beg the West and Ukraine for pardon for this gross, horrible crimes and violation and so on, is definitely not in Chinese interests, because this Russia would be most likely Western-friendly and anti-Chinese, and then just group of countries that are in the contained China camp would expand. How is that beneficial for the Chinese? So their interest is also to keep Putin or somebody like Putin in place, and that's non-negotiable for them. So how do you craft an outcome that China can live with, and it also has some positive incentives to exercise pressure on Russia in order to get it to a place where it can relinquish this ambition to control Ukraine, right? I think that's really a very worthy exercise for diplomacy, but unfortunately we don't have anybody who would think that way, particularly in the most consequential country around this war, and that's the United States.
Well, I hope they do, because at the end of the day, negotiating an end to such a conflict when the two parties are so far apart and each of them in their own mind have existential threats or existential issues at stake, that the negotiated outcome will have to address in some way, to some degree, those existential issues and interests to every single party to the conflict. And I'm including China to that, the Europeans, the Americans, the Ukrainians, and the Russians. So the question is, what scenario actually at least ticks some of the boxes for every single actor in this crisis? I did want to make sure before we end to ask you about people inside of Russia, because I think the human cost of this war obviously has been so devastating. And, I'm going to be having a Ukraine-focused episode with someone from Ukraine to talk about the human cost from their side. I think it's less clear what's happening on the Russian side and the toll that this war has taken on people living inside of Russia. I read just today about the digital draft where notifications where the minute a Russian gets a draft notification, essentially Russia's borders are closed to them. They're not allowed to leave. There are huge fines for not answering the call for the draft. Could you just tell us about the toll that this has had inside of Russia and whether you see a different kind of future for Russia, just speaking domestically?
I think that you have a certain rallying around the flag effect right now as the war is in year 4. The initial reaction was deep confusion because the society was not prepared to this war. I don't think that the Kremlin was really preparing the society that we will go full into Ukraine. They couldn't believe their eyes when they woke up on February 24th. And like before the war, I had many discussions with my contacts in Moscow. And I said, like, watch the space. Like, it's actually coming. And it's like, oh, you're full of shit, Sasha. Like, you read too much of New York Times and you're under spell of your former boss, Bill Burns, who was president of Carnegie and then was director of the CIA. And you look at various military elements, talk to various military experts, and say, like, these preparations just don't make sense if that's not going to be an invasion. And then I think with Bill and a lot of people who were back then in the U.S. government, if you ask me for one word, I would say integrity. This would be definitely not the people who want to give the Secretary of State a bottle of fake substance and claim that this is a weapons of mass destruction from Iraq and so on, right? This would be not people who would be messing with intelligence. And for understandable reasons, for sources and methods, they want to hold their cards very close to their chest about how they know certain stuff. But the level of confidence to me, and having experience working with these people, made all of the boxes tick that, okay, this is going to happen, right? But people in very senior cabinet positions in Russia that I still talked to before my immigration were in absolute disbelief. And they were not playing, I can tell you. They were really genuine. So the initial reaction for everybody was a big shock because imagining that Russia will bombard Kiev, that we will kill Ukrainians were absolutely anathema because this talk about, oh, brotherly nations, it's like the U.S. attacking Canada, right? Actually going to war with Canada. I think that people will be totally shocked, right? And then the problem was that for quarter century, democracy and civil society was stifled in Russia. There have been thousands and thousands of dissidents behind the bars, some of them killed, some of them pushed into exile already. No independent press that would have a mass audience, no opposition parties to speak of who could be opposed to that. Really a string of successive street protests starting in 2011, getting smaller and smaller and smaller, with the Russian police force brutality going bigger and bigger and bigger to scare the public away. So on the day of the invasion, we had a street protest in Moscow, a city with 17 million people, daytime population, of just 2,000 people going to the street to protest, right? The brave people. A lot of people put kind of black avatars on their Facebook profiles and so on. A lot of people were like crying for several weeks. The alcohol consumption went up and so on. But the society was so atomized and so shocked that nobody could, organize and make a quick move and say, hey, that's totally unacceptable in a way that this would matter. And then after a couple of months, in the first weeks, the government very speedily adopted some of the repressive laws, basically introducing military censorship, and started to do this demonstrative court cases against some of the opposition figures and so on, to just make people see that the state means it. They're really brutal. And then with that, all of the polling that is available shows that there are perhaps 10% of Russians who are staunchly anti-war, who understand that this is totally immoral, horrible, and are against it, but they are invisible. because criticizing the war in public is a criminal offense, right? There is probably 20% of the population that's really bloodthirsty, that are convinced that this is a just war, that we are fighting fascists, that we are fighting against all of NATO and so on. And 70% of the population who just, people who want to be left alone, who want to zoom out, who say like, it's so torturing to look into that I don't want to know. So you build a wall inside your consciousness, or people who were not interested in politics and say like, oh, that's somewhere remote, like I'm not interested. Or people say, well, oh, it's too complicated. And then the government is very skilled in providing these people points for doubt when they say, oh, but Ukrainians are also not so innocent. And look, the Ukrainian drone has hit a Russian residential building and innocent people have died, which has also happened because it's war, and air defenses shoot down drones and they fall on houses, and then all of that stuff happens on the Russian side as well, disproportionately. So there are very few Russian casualties compared to civilian casualties compared to Ukrainian casualties. And then the question who started first does matter. But then it doesn't matter for some people if you are in year 4, right? In year 4 of this conflict that the propaganda is telling you is existential for your country, the other side is supported by all of NATO, it's a proxy war and so on, it stops mattering for you who started. And I know a lot of people who started as staunch anti-war, and now some of them who are still in Russia are like, well, it's very complicated. And some of them have completely gone on the dark side and say, yeah, like whatever the origin, we need to fight and we need to win. And that's a scary thing. Like the parting thought will be a dark one if you want to, is that it's just very difficult to undo that, because this legacy of the war, hatred towards the West, hatred towards Ukrainian patriots, is now ingrained into the school curriculum, in the kindergarten curriculum, starting from this year. A lot of positions of power would be occupied by veterans of this war, with PTSD, not treated, but also people who lost comrades and who would believe that they fought for Russia's sovereignty, greatness, territorial integrity, and so on, and who will be in charge. And also these smart technocrats on the monetary policy side who will be running the central bank and so on. Their formative experience will be circumvention of Western sanctions, fighting this war through economic and financial means. So that will be the backbone of the system. And then also a discussion like, okay, if we zoom out from the moral dimension, in pragmatic terms, that war will ultimately make Russia poorer, led to NATO's expansion, NATO kind of refurbishing its military might. So it actually created many problems that were justification for this war. So it made these problems much more acute. It destroyed sources of long-term prosperity for Russia, deprived us from a more prosperous future, and made us a junior partner to China, increasingly on Chinese terms, with not that many alternatives. How is that a smart strategy for Russia? Even if we don't talk about moral element, which needs to be talked in every conversation about that, right? These discussions cannot happen inside Russia. They can happen outside. That's the reason why I left, right? Because you feel that this place needs to exist. So in Russia, we only have two forms of dissent historically. You either go to Siberia, to Gulag, or you go into exile.
Out of all the options, that's the best one.
That's a comfy vegetarian option. Like I'm blessed working with terrific colleagues at Carnegie, but there is also this call of duty that you need to do that, and then we all have agency. I think that we need to exercise humility, that our voices cannot change, Putin's thinking or Russians' people thinking, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try, because it still has some impact. And the fact that I know that a lot of senior Russian officials still read analysis that we produce, and they want to reach out, they want to ask questions sometimes. I think that's positive, because part of my job is to bring this analysis to the bottom of their heart and brain, for them to not be able to share that with others, but to understand that we are doing something wrong. So maybe this planted seed of doubt will grow into something when Putin is out of the picture.
It's interesting also because there have been so many Russians that have left who are now living in former Soviet countries or in Turkey or in London, who've moved their capital outside of Russia and into those countries. But this picture that you're painting of a Russian society that is really changing from the inside, and that those who have stayed or who couldn't leave, and how their mentalities are changing, what the experiences are that they've lived through, what their children are learning or being forced to learn, what skills they're learning in terms of evading sanctions, and who will be leading the country moving forward, and whether there will just be an irreversible sort of schism between the people who stayed and became shaped by the war experience and the people who left, and whether that can ever come back together again. Because I think just in terms of looking at really long-term societal ramifications of this war for Russia and for Russians is something that I haven't seen a lot of people spend time talking about.
I think that you're totally right. And like this division is happening already. And like I've experienced that myself, that it's just difficult to talk to many people that you knew. And like, well, talking to me now is not criminal libel per se, but since I'm on the Russian wanted list, they issued a global arrest warrant and so on, like a lot of people are just afraid of talking, though they probably would be interested in. But I think that on the side of people who left Russia, there is so much bitterness towards the regime and towards the people. Like, why are you not revolting? Why are you not, overthrowing Putin? Like, this is so horrible. So empathy to try understand the other is missing big time. And I think that's empathy on the Russian side, first and foremost, towards Ukrainians, right? I think that this Russia has become a society that's really deeply atomized, deeply distrustful for each other, and that empathy was building up a little bit after the breakup of the Soviet Union. And then the Kremlin was trying to kill this and like bring the society back into this atomized mode because it's much easier to rule. Like you know it from your experience in the Middle East. That's the way these regimes work. And we have history of centuries of rule of that sort throughout the imperial time, and then definitely Soviet Union that got very skilled at this. And Putin just discovered the same truth that many authoritarian regimes discovered, that societies where there is empathy and horizontal organizations are just far more difficult to suppress. So I think that this lack of empathy is there on both sides of the discussion, both the people who are in exile and Russians who are inside, and stitch that together is very difficult. I know very few people and a couple of colleagues who are public intellectuals who are trying to do that, to just understand the conditions in which the Russian people inside the country are living, and trying to make that case that, okay, you also need to see human on the other side, which is difficult in the European public discussion, which is for obvious and absolutely understandable reasons dominated by sympathy to Ukrainians and a lot of disgust and detestment towards the Russians. And I think that this, like why don't they revolt is very much there. Problem is that very few European countries, particularly in Western Europe, have lived under the dictatorship and understand how this countries work.
Easier said than done to revolt. I mean, we hear it in Gaza. Why don't they revolt against Hamas? Like, well, it's a bit difficult. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me, Sasha. I really appreciate it. Thank you for your time. It was a great pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Jasmine. It's always great to talk to you, and in person next time.
In person next time. I hope you learned as much as I did from that conversation. If you want to hear more conversations like this, please don't forget to follow us wherever you get your podcasts, subscribe to our videos on YouTube, leave a comment or a review, and you can also always email us at jasmine@viewfromherepod.com. That's Jasmine at viewfromherepod.com. As always, thank you so much for listening. I'm Jasmine El Gamal, and this is The View From Here.